Hi, I'm Dr. Brandy Kellett, and I teach in the Department of English and Modern Languages here at Lipscomb. And my background is in Postcolonial Studies and African American Studies. And so I study global literature in many ways, but particularly from the vantage point of thinking about what it means to live in the African diaspora, particularly by those voices from the West Indies, the Caribbean, and from America. And so I'm so excited to share with you today a little bit of background and in post-colonial thinking, but mostly I'm excited to share with you a sort of pitch for why African American studies needs to be approached from a post-colonial perspective. And so this is sort of my apologetic for why I think we need to marry these two ideas in really fluid ways. But I'm so excited that you're enrolled in this course, and I hope you're having a great semester so far with Dean Holmes. I'll just jump right in and get us started. So Toni Morrison, in her fiction or in her nonfiction book called Playing in the Dark: Whiteness and the Literary Imagination, wrote about this idea that the white imagination and white literature and white sort of national identity in the United States is very much obsessed with and haunted by the Black presence. And so I just want to start us by acknowledging and affirming that African American writing, African American thinking and culture is really central to our American literature and our American identity. Morrison says in this book that the contemplation of this Black presence is central to any understanding of our national literature and should not be permitted to hover at the margins of the literary imagination. And I agree. So part of what I hope you're getting to do this semester is take these thinkers and take these writers and take these historians and these culture makers and creators and icons and move them from where they've hovered, maybe at the margins of society, and move them back to the center where they belong. And that is really what post-colonial thinking does. James Baldwin, in the documentary I Am Not Your Negro, that's about his writings, speaks primarily to a white audience, but really to all Americans, and says, listen, when we think about the problems of America, it's not a racial problem. It's a problem of whether you are willing to look at your life and be responsible for it, and then begin to change it. And so I think there's room in that conversation for all of us. I think Baldwin issues us an invitation for all of us to look at our lives, look at our notions of culture, look at our understanding of literature, and decide to be responsible for what we do with it and to change the things that are wrong. That is in some ways the basis of what post-colonial studies and post-colonial thinking does. And so today I want to begin by quickly explaining what colonialism is and what the colonial endeavor did to our world, and then to talk about the post-colonial response and what post-colonial studies hopes to accomplish in their work. And then I'll sort of explain what my hope is for the time that I'll spend with you today. So first, just to give you a very brief and frankly probably irresponsible grounding in what the colonial endeavor is. In the 1400s, for the next 400 to 500 years, and then some people would say it's ongoing today, I would be one of those people, is what we call the Age of Empire. And essentially in the 1400s, 5 central European powers, Spain, France, England, Portugal, and the Netherlands conquered the globe. And their attempt to do that was often fueled by the church. And so there was a Christianizing prospect behind that endeavor. And it was also an endeavor to increase their power, increase their authority, and increase their wealth through the theft of natural resources. The impact of the colonial endeavor is that in many, many countries and other spaces around the world, primarily in Africa, India, South America, and Latin America, there was an embedded long ago into those cultures a cultural inferiority. So there was an erasure of the history that already existed. And this is when history begins, when the colonial empire sort of arrives on your continent. And so that's why in America in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. For a lot of American school children, they learned that's when America began, right? And so the colonial endeavor erases the history that existed and embeds within the new people group a cultural inferiority about what existed before. It also establishes very intense, powerful hegemonic norms, which basically is a snooty way to say that there is an all-powerful hierarchical structure where money and faith and culture and power exist, and the entire society is then set up to protect and to praise and to sort of bow down to that hegemonic power. And so part of the colonial endeavor is that it really required others to participate in their own oppression. The hegemonic power was so incredibly powerful, with the power of life and death, starvation, ostracism, that everyone involved either lost their lives or learned quickly to participate in their own oppression. So in order to stay in good standing with the colonial power, we learned to bow down to the king that really had nothing to do with us, right? And all of this required an acceptance of an unjust status quo. And all of this is deeply embedded in so many places for hundreds of years. And if you know much about American history, you know that we dance around these ideas, and we love to talk about the American Revolution, and we love to talk about how we resisted the idea that our culture was inferior, and we resisted the idea that our history could be erased, and we resisted the powerful hegemonic norms, and we refused to participate in our own oppression. And so we dumped all their tea in the sea, right? And we would not accept an unjust status quo, which is what sort of sparked our American Revolution. That is a really unique story globally in many ways. Not a lot of countries pull that off well, but it's also really short-sighted because, of course, the we that we talk about when we think about America is not the we that existed when Columbus arrived. And so when we think about what it means to be a part of the colonial endeavor, this is the long history of how erasure occurred, how inferiority happened, and how an oppressive and unjust status quo continued. And so when we think about post-colonial thinking, it's really a response to the colonial endeavor. And so post-colonial in this context has less to do with a specific time frame of when it occurred or when it started, but the post does suggest that there is a response to the colonial endeavor and a rejection of what colonialism did for the places that it inhabited. And so in post-colonial studies, we talk a lot about resisting that erasure and revising and reviving another version of history, right? So a great sort of product of post-colonial thinking would be to pair Columbus Day in the United States with Indigenous Peoples Day, right? It's not to reject that this history happened, that Columbus came and radically changed our futures forever, but it is to say we need to revise this history to tell a bigger picture, to tell a fuller picture. Post-colonial studies affirms a multi-narrative approach. It rejects the notion of a master narrative, sort of one winning narrative, and instead really works to elevate voices that were victims and victimized. It elevates voices for people who often had no voice. And so it affirms that it's necessary to have lots of approaches to get history down correctly. Post-colonial thinking acknowledges that there are gaps and moments of erasure in history, and we'll talk a lot about this with African American studies and with thinking about what it means to know your history and to know your rootedness. If your history is embedded in slavery, if you come from people who were enslaved, if your history begins on the Middle Passage in many ways, then that's a big gap, right? In many cases, that's haunted by this erasure, by the history of non-history, the history of lack. It also clarifies the oppressive relationship of colonialism. So post-colonial studies and writing has done wonders to sort of clarify what fueled the colonial endeavor, how the Christianizing influence was deeply hypocritical and violent and destructive in many ways, really anti-Christ in many ways. It really clarifies this oppressive relationship, the theft, the violence, the hierarchy that was baked in. And then finally, post-colonial thinking and studies establish and celebrate cultural value. And that's what drew me to this work. In post-colonial thinking, we celebrate the cultural value of those cultures that have been erased by colonialism. And so part of African American studies and this course that you're in is so well married to post-colonial thinking, I think, because what you're doing is establishing and celebrating the cultural value of the work of African Americans on America, right? On the way that we think about education and literature and history and art and culture. So in many ways, you're engaging in a post-colonial effort by sitting in the classroom that you're in. And so the goals for today in our remaining time are really just two things. One, I want to help you, I want to defend my idea that a post-colonial outlook is not just helpful, but necessary to engage in African American studies well. And then number two, just to tell you what it is and how we do it. And so I'm going to borrow from lots of scholars, and I just hope that you can catch the highlights here as you understand what this approach means and what it looks like. And so our first goal, why is a post-colonial outlook necessary? There's four key ideas, really five, but we'll call them four, that I just want to mention to help you understand why a post-colonial outlook is necessary. The first is from a scholar named Dion Brand, who came up with this notion of the door of no return. And when she talks about the door of no return, she's talking about, in many ways, sort of a meta-imagined space where the African diaspora began, so back in Africa. And in other ways, she's talking about an actual door, the actual gateway on the coast of Africa, where the slave trade, where the Middle Passage really began. And so the door of no return is the place where they left one place for another place. And for Brand, it signifies this rupture in history. She says that it's impossible to go back. It makes diasporic lives a fiction that are created by empire. And yet we participate in creating our history to it and for it. It does limit and signal loss, but as so much African American literature shows us, it also empowers and gives us space for resistance and self-actualization. So I think a post-colonial outlook is necessary because I think to really understand African American literature and history and culture, you have to know that they're speaking back to this door of no return. There's a bigger context than just the spatial set and temporal setting of the book that you're reading. In many ways, this literature is always speaking back to the door of no return, talking about how to get there. The other idea that sort of backs that up are these two giants in Caribbean studies and thinking. One is named Derek Walcott, and he is from St. Lucia and is actually a Nobel Prize winner. He's a poet, but he wrote an essay called The Muse of History. And he talks about and demonstrates that we're all haunted by our histories. And if you don't know your history, if your history is not accessible, if your history is a gap, then the haunting is all the stronger. And Jamaica Kincaid is from Antigua, and she's a writer who has an essay called The Sea is History. And she talks about that for anyone in the African diaspora, anyone who is an African American or identifies as an African American has to grapple with this idea that they long for the muse of history, that they want to be visited by the muse of history. They want to understand their history and grow out of their history. And yet, in many ways, the sea is history. Their history has been erased. Their history has been rewritten by people with no claim to that history. And so these ideas that really come from a post-colonial lens are necessary, I think, as you think about African American studies. Is the history of African Americans largely despair and domination? How do we tell this story of who we are? How do we tell the story of how we came to be? how do we challenge the narratives that have been placed upon the African American story with our own new stories, right? How do we go back into the sea, which is a place that erases and drowns, and find the core seeds of our histories there? How do we do that? And so part of this idea is necessary for us, I think, because it reminds us that we need to tell the story. We need new language to tell this story. We need to tell our histories. The third idea that really tells us that the post-colonial outlook is necessary for African American thinking and African American studies is this brilliant notion of unhomeliness by Homi Bhabha. So Homi Bhabha is a cultural critic and post-colonial scholar, and he talks about how to locate our cultures and how to think about our cultures. And that's so much of what you're doing in this course. You're thinking about culture and where it came from and what it means and how it influences us. And so he says that any attempt to articulate oneself or one's culture in the present requires and must recognize how the past has shaped it. So for him, individual and communal identity is not just constructed through affirmation, but also revealed through lack. And so this is a key idea of post-colonial thinking that I think will be really helpful to you when you think about African American studies. That it's when we think about our identities and when we think about how we construct ourselves, and if we think of ourselves as sort of fixed in one place or as fluid and evolving, we don't just do that through the positive stories that we've heard. And Bhabha would say that part of how we shape our identities is by wrestling with and interacting with the lack that we've experienced, the missing pieces, right? He says what he calls presencing. He says presencing begins when we acknowledge there's not a binary between the past and the present. There's not a binary between home and where I am home and where away is or where I'm from. That those are not separate things. That he would say there's not even a binary between the public and your public persona and your private life, or your communal identity and your individual identity. So he would say that it's in these in-between spaces, in between public and private, in between the past and the present, in between home and not home, that we can begin to sort of hold ourselves and figure out who we are. And so he would say that as we wrestle with our unhomeliness, as we see ourselves maybe as unhomed, as people without a deep home, we begin to relocate ourselves within a space of intervention where we can bear witness to the histories of loss that have come behind us and the ways that we are right now. James Clifford is another cultural critic, and he says that displacement might be crucial to our understanding of ourselves and the power that we have. And so for post-colonial thinking and how it influences African American studies, anyone who identifies in African American spaces and anyone who works in studying African American history and literature and culture has to wrestle with these ideas around unhomeliness. We have to wrestle with how to create space between our displacement and between our belonging, where we can think about who we are and why we matter and where we belong. And I think this is what African American literature offers us, a space for all of that. Okay, the fourth and final idea on why a post-colonial outlook is really necessary in my telling of the story comes from Frantz Fanon, who is a French scholar who wrote a book that's really important to my work called Black Skin and White Masks. And in that book, Frantz Fanon really sort of investigates and thinks about what the colonial endeavor, or for African American studies, maybe we could think about what a racial hierarchy, what that system does to us. He would say, Frantz Fanon would say, that it created an inferiority complex in folks because of the death and burial of their original cultures. And Fanon would say that that leads often, if we don't wrestle with it, it leads to shame and self-contempt in the relationship of African Americans to whites. And so for Black folks, especially Black folks in America, we have to wrestle with these ideas. White folks and Black folks, we have to wrestle with these ideas. We have to wrestle with what it means to be always counteracting and responding to this inferiority complex that Fanon talks about. And so that's my pitch for why a post-colonial outlook is necessary and really helpful when we think about African American studies. And then finally, I just want to help you understand how we use these ideas and how I think you can use these ideas. And so the first idea that post-colonial studies gives us that I think you'll totally resonate with when you think about African American studies is that it teaches you to bear witness to the trauma of the past, and in so doing to resist your current oppression and to resist historical and present erasure. So Ian Balcom is a scholar from Britain who wrote a book called Specters of the Atlantic, and he just talks about that, listen, for people in the African diaspora, people who are rooted in or born in Africa and live in other parts of the world now, there is this gap in the archive. And he says that we can begin to close this gap by producing an often mostly imagined counter archive. But Balcom says that it's worth reading, it's worth uncovering, it's a worthwhile endeavor to resist this erasure and to bear witness to trauma of our past. We can't talk about African American studies without talking about trauma. My work in trauma really borrows a lot from Holocaust studies. They've done such good work there, and from just trauma theory. And part of the things they talk about when they talk about bearing witness to trauma, that it's helpful. And you know this if you've been in counseling, you can't heal if you don't name a thing. You can't interact with a thing if you don't talk about it and acknowledge it. And that's really rooted here too, that we have to remember the names of people who have been lost or been hurt. We have to name abusers and name abuse that has occurred. This happens beautifully throughout African American studies in history and literature. And that's why sometimes it can be seen as an unpatriotic endeavor, because it really challenges the status quo of saying everything's fine, just keep the peace. Post-colonial studies would teach us, and African American studies would live out the reality that we have to name these things. We have to commemorate the victims. We have to name abuse when we see it, and we have to remember these ideas. When we do that, when we do raise these issues, we can begin to pursue justice. That's what bearing witness to trauma can do for us. And we can also really empower survivors. And so the first way that we can use these ideas is to think about how to integrate past trauma, either from your own life, from the work you're reading in African American studies, or from the long view of thinking back to the door of no return, to this long, history. How do we integrate that past trauma into our current understandings of ourselves, both individually and collectively? How do we do that well? Well, the other way that we do that is to position ourselves as subjects. Now, this is a very strange term, and I understand that, but I hope to break it down for you. I'm talking about subject positionality, which is a $50 word. But when we think about positioning ourselves as a subject, I want you to remember where we began with Toni Morrison. Think about how she said the notion of an African American or a Black presence really haunts American literature. And it's always existed on the margins, but it's not on the margins, it's at the center of our story. And so part of how we do that is that we place ourselves at the center of the story. African American studies, when done really well and understood well, helps you not think of the African American life as an object to be looked at and talked about and understood and deconstructed, and instead to place you at the center of the work as a subject, as the star of your own show, as a full person with agency, right? And so when I talk about positioning yourself as a subject, you become the I in the story, right? There's not a narrator talking about your life, you're talking about your life. And so you position yourself as a subject, you engage in subject positionality by doing this, by thinking about embodying an empowered state of being in which you act autonomously. A person who's positioned as a subject really is self-actualized. You're present, and you've integrated your past with agency into your future. And so the idea of positioning yourself as a subject doesn't mean that you're fixed and you're always powerful and you never experience weakness or you never experience oppression or hierarchy, but it does mean that you sort of have affirmed yourself as you negotiate with you and your own past and with others. And so that's one of the ways that you can use this when you think about African American studies. As you read, as you listen to music, as you engage in art, as you read short stories or other pieces of literature, how do the characters position themselves as subjects? What's required for them to do that? Well, I think what's required for them to do that is that they have to bear witness to the past, to the trauma there. They have to resist their own participation in an oppressive system. And then they have to develop a diasporic consciousness. And that is one of the last things we'll talk about. So a diasporic consciousness is this idea that as you go throughout your life and live in your sort of conscious self, you are constantly aware of your presence in the African diaspora. So I've talked a lot about that today. I probably should have defined it at the beginning of the lecture. To live in the diaspora, and actually I'll borrow from Paul Christopher Johnson, who says that diasporas are social identifications based on shared memory bridges, linking a lived space and a left behind space. The remembered land must be sustained through periodic physical returns, imagined and ritualized, either or both. And so when we think about living in the diaspora, especially in the African diaspora, these are folks who identify socially with people who are rooted in either physically by visiting there, by being born there, or sort of emotionally, mentally, physically, sociologically rooted in the African story. And so part of how we position ourselves as subjects, part of how we understand and receive and analyze African American studies and really embrace the gift that it is to begin to develop a diasporic consciousness and to see how the work that you're studying develops its own diasporic consciousness. How does a person you read in class talk about their placement in the African diaspora? They might do it on the nose. They might name places from Africa, name traditions or cultural legacies from Africa, or it might just be baked in to the underbelly of the work, right? It might just be subtext, but it's there. I guarantee you it's there. And so as you study African American work, look for and think about what you might learn to call the diasporic consciousness that the work holds. Being in the diaspora is not about closing the gaps of time or memory or space, but it's about actively engaging them as a source of meaning. So baked into diasporic thinking is a notion of longing, that we long to go back, that we long to belong, we long to be with our people and our land. But there's also this really beautiful, empowering idea that it can be a source of meaning even if you're not physically in the space, that it can mean something to you whether you're there or not. And then finally, how do we use these ideas? Well, we use them to create, and that's what you're studying this semester. You're getting to think about what African American studies is, what it has been, how it has been a place of resistance and beauty and life, and bearing witness and challenging historical erasure, and what it means in the future. And so I'll wrap up by telling you about Paula Marshall, who is a woman born in New York to Barbadian parents. And so she really grew up understanding that African Americans are not just one group, that it's a new layer on the African diaspora. And so for her, to borrow from Homie Baba and unhomeliness, she knew there was a difference in home, because when her family talked about home, they talked about Barbados and being here, which for her was New York. And so she was always aware of the tension that Baba talks about. That's such a part of the African American story. And so living in America, she would say that living in America while you're Black means resisting the powerful norms of racial, cultural, and caste-based hierarchies. And to resist these things, Paula Marshall would say, and I would second, and I know Dean Holmes would too, and I hope you will too after this course, that the way we resist that those norms that can destroy you are to create. That creation and creating is an act of resistance. And so Paula Marshall remembers growing up, her mom cleaned the homes of white people. And a lot of her mom's friends also cleaned the homes of wealthy white people. And so she said that she learned to resist by hearing her mom and her friends talk about their day, talk about cleaning these houses. And she said that when they told each other stories, it restored to them, and I'm quoting now, it restored to them a sense of themselves and reaffirmed their self-worth. Through language, they were able to overcome the humiliations of their workday. So Paula Marshall's mom, who really carried a tripled invisibility, she was she was a Black woman, she was a woman, and she was from another place and had an accent. And so those three things make you triply invisible in American mainstream culture. And your only worth can be seen through grunt labor, right? And so she talks about the fact that they couldn't tolerate, I'm quoting again, they couldn't tolerate the fact of their invisibility, their powerlessness, and they fought back using the only weapon at their command, the spoken word. And so I'll just leave you with that the act of creating is an act of resistance, but the act of creating is the fruit of African American studies. It's what created what you're doing in this course. But I think the best way to tackle the act of creating and analyze these creations and the cultural artifacts of that created work is to think through a post-colonial lens. And so I'll just leave you with my hope for you as you read some questions that maybe you can carry with you throughout the semester. And so I'd love for you to write these down or to have them sort of in the back of your brain whenever you engage a text or a writer or a piece of art in this course. And that's to think about history. Think about how the text or the writers appropriate, manipulate, revise, issue for the first time, or bear witness to, or imagine history. How do they grapple with all of that? Number two, where do you notice the gaps and erasures? And where do you sense a developing of diasporic consciousness? Where can you catch that we talked about a minute ago? Where can you start to pick up on and think about diasporic consciousness? And then third, how does the telling of history challenge the status quo, offer avenues of resistance, or articulate empowered cultural legacies? Because that's really what we're talking about, right? We're not just talking about what it means to remember history, to grapple with history, to fight history, to go back and try to reclaim history. We're talking about how to position ourselves as subjects and how to really engage in and find meaning through resistance and through an empowered cultural legacy. The beauty of post-colonial thinking and how it can influence the way you talk about African American studies is that while this is a story of loss and oppression and trauma, and that needs to be an erasure, and all of that needs to be borne witness to and fought against, that's not all it is. It's also crazy important and powerful resistance. It is digging deep into your past to develop your own diasporic consciousness, which leads you to position yourself as a subject. There are incredible legacies to be found here. And I think we do a disservice when we try to divorce them from the deep past that they're always wrestling with. And we also do a disservice when we say it's mostly a story of loss or mostly a story of lack. Let's reject those binaries and instead find new ways to build bridges as we create and as we celebrate this literature and history. So thanks so much for having me. I'm available to any of you anytime if you want to find me on campus, brandy.kellett@lipscomb.edu. And I wish you all the best as you grapple with the great work of African American studies.